Darkblade Ascent is a melee roguelike RPG currently in early access with a fairly addicting gameplay loop and smooth first-person combat that I believe shows a great deal of promise. It's also the passion project of a dev team consisting of two brothers who are frequently updating their game and seem to be very receptive to player feedback. But how does it stack up against other titles with first-person melee combat and roguelike elements? My name's Johnny Bueno and let's take a look at Darkblade Ascent. Before jumping into the game, we're treated to a bit of text that sets up the game's story and characters. You are the Darkblade, an assassin for hire that was tasked with killing a sorcerer named Malavar. The Darkblade did the deed and whacked Malavar, only for Malavar to separate the planes of existence in a last desperate act, upsetting the world's balance. It turns out killing Malavar was a big no-no, as this pisses off the Soul Weaver, whose job is to maintain the world's balance. Because of the Darkblade's hubris, the Soul Weaver decides he must be punished and condemns him to a purgatorial realm to endure perpetual anguish. Here, the Soul Weaver forces the Darkblade to dress business casual and sit in a cubicle for 10 hours a day. Wait, sorry, wrong purgatory. Here, the Soul Weaver offers the Darkblade a path to deliverance by trudging through a labyrinth filled with foes who serve as echoes of the suffering he's inflicted in the past as an assassin. By ascending through the labyrinth, the Darkblade can prove he is worthy of absolution from his sins, hence Darkblade Ascent. And that's our story setup. And honestly, I found it to be a pretty compelling storyline. Yes, you don't learn anything else during the actual game, and the introductory lore dump is about all you get, but I found it compelling nonetheless, and it's probably more in-depth than most of the other early access roguelikes I've reviewed. I particularly like how the story ties into the game's roguelike elements of perpetually doing runs, essentially serving as the Darkblade's own version of hell. In addition to that, the intro text also included some surprisingly nice voice acting, helping set the tone for the game.
Realizing the importance of Malavar's role in preserving the world's delicate balance, an unfamiliar feeling of remorse overwhelms your haunted soul.
When actually in the game, you'll work your way through a series of zones consisting of a sewer, a castle village, the castle itself, a mountain path, and some swampy ruins among a few others. There is some decent variety in zones here, but nothing too out of the ordinary from what you'd see in a typical dark fantasy game. The general presentation of each area is nice, and the developers do capture the gritty, unwelcoming dark fantasy aesthetic quite well. However, there really isn't much opportunity to deviate a bit and explore each zone, as you're stuck in a set linear path for the entire game. In traditional roguelike fashion, you'll work your way through a series of rooms, and you need to clear a room of enemies before being able to progress to the next one. The enemies, item drops, and power-ups you receive in those rooms are randomized, but the general path you take to progress through the game is static. Some zones did have a few branching paths here and there, but for the most part you'll be seeing a lot of the same scenery time and time again. This wasn't really a huge issue for me though, since this is a roguelike and I'm really more focused on engaging with the game's progression system and combat. When starting a new run, you'll need to select a class to play as, with the current version of the game having 3 options: Pyromancer, Stormcaller, and Frostweaver. This does feel like a very limited selection, but the roadmap accessible from the game's main menu does mention that there's more classes coming, with the next one being the Berserker. So I'd expect much more variety as the game progresses through early access. Once you select a class, it's time to start your run and engage in Darkblade Ascent's own brand of first-person melee combat. And overall, it's a pretty simple brand of combat with the ability to attack, dash, parry, riposte, and push back enemies. Unlike other first-person melee games I've played, there only appears to be one method of attacking with your equipped weapon, as opposed to having different inputs for, say, light attacks and heavy attacks. This doesn't necessarily make Darkblade Ascent's combat less engaging, as there are other factors we'll get into that make combat more dynamic. Dashing operates more like a short-range teleport, and parrying works like usual, by hitting the parry input just before being hit with an attack. Parrying not only allows for an immediate and powerful riposte attack following a successful parry, but also lets you perform a pushback attack to get some distance between you and your enemies. What I found interesting was that you actually get to keep your pushback and can use it any time after a parry, giving you a sort of pushback charge to be used at your leisure. So there's essentially 2 rewards you get for parrying enemy attacks, emphasizing the importance of staying in the fray and timing parries correctly as opposed to dashing to safety. One other thing I liked is that you can also parry magic projectiles, and there's even power-ups that enhance the spell damage you reflect back at the caster. The timing for parrying magic felt a bit rough at first, but once you get used to it, it feels incredibly satisfying to put those cowardly mages in their place, especially since you don't have many options for ranged combat. One thing to note is that there isn't any option to simply block attacks. Your only means of defense are parries and dodging, both of which cost stamina to use. During my first few hours of the game, I found myself out of stamina very often, becoming entirely vulnerable to attacks without having the stamina to dodge or parry. This was admittedly frustrating at first, but became something I grew to appreciate more over time as the developers are clearly emphasizing stamina management as a key aspect to combat. You can't just infinitely dodge or hold block to turtle your way through a fight. You need to actually watch your stamina to make sure you have the resources available to stay out of trouble. This adds a layer of thoughtfulness to your actions in combat that ends up feeling pretty rewarding. As a somewhat annoying side note though, if you try to dodge or parry and you don't have the stamina to do so, your character will let you know, every single time. I'm glad the Darkblade has a bit of voice acting, but I do wish there was a way to at least mute this line.
Not enough stamina. No stamina. Not enough stamina. No stamina.
Until that's added though, maybe keeping the Darkblade quiet can be seen as another reason to keep a close eye on your stamina bar. Moving on to weaponry, there really isn't a ton to choose from in the current version of the game as there are only 4 weapon categories: swords, spears, axes, and daggers. Each will have randomized effects on them like increased damage with specific elements or increased health and stamina. These few weapon types do at least feel different to use from one another, with daggers for example having relentless low damage attacks that require you to be very close to your enemies. Each weapon type also comes with a single unique ability, like axes having a conal area attack or swords having a sort of flurry attack. However, you don't get these weapon abilities right away and must first unlock them via a skill tree, which we'll look at when we talk about progression. The very small variety of weapons does get a little old after a few runs, especially since you only start with swords unlocked and need to unlock the remaining 3 through leveling up. So hopefully we can see weapon variety being a priority over the next few major updates, but for now it does feel rather lacking. As mentioned before, as you play Darkblade Ascent, you'll need to clear a room out of enemies before being able to proceed to the next room to do the same thing again. Enemies will get progressively stronger as you move between zones, so you'll need to keep picking up stronger weapons that match your build to stand a fighting chance. Enemies themselves are pretty simple though and consist of basic melee enemies with 1 repeating attack, larger stronger enemies also with 1 repeating attack, and mages that shoot projectiles at you from incredible range. The actual style of enemies does change between each major zone, like fighting the undead in the sewers or these orc/goblin dudes and trolls in the mountains. But they're largely the same in how you engage with them, with the only exception being the enemies you encounter in the game's current final zone. There's also some added variation in gameplay during a run when you encounter an abyss portal. This takes you to an alternate dimension where you can fight waves of enemies for increased rewards. The more waves you do, the greater number of enemies you fight, and the juicier the rewards become. Because healing is limited in this game, I always found myself questioning if doing another wave was worth it, adding a level of risk versus reward to the game that I found quite enticing. Oh, and one quick note on boss fights while we're still talking gameplay, the 2 I encountered during my time with the game weren't super challenging. They seem to move incredibly slow, making them easy to parry, though they do have much more variation in their attacks compared to basic enemies, adding a bit of strategy to their fights. However, they are absolute meat shields in regards to their health pools, so if you don't have enough damage in your build, be ready for a slog of a fight. As you slay enemies in Darkblade Ascent, you'll accrue experience and eventually gain a level in the out-of-game progression system. This is where you'll unlock the game's other weapons and classes at specific levels, as you start out with only the Sword and Pyromancer class unlocked. It's a pretty standard roguelike affair where the game gradually introduces you to more gameplay options, though this is based more on combat and less on discovery. In addition, every level grants you a point that can be spent in a type of talent tree with sections for each element, weapon type, and other in-game stats. For the most part, these point investments aren't too special, as each of these smaller nodes only boost damage for the respective element or weapon, or increase your total health or stamina. What you really want to gun for is the 5th node in each section, which actually does unlock something more unique, like a weapon ability as mentioned earlier, or an added on-hit effect for each element type. These are obviously much more impactful and make a noticeable difference in gameplay, unlike the nodes that lead up to them. Simple damage increases are fine, but I do wish there was at least some more variation here to make investing your points feel more worthwhile. Moving on to the classes, each class has a set of passive skills and a single ability that's unique to that class. For example, the Pyromancer can shoot out a fireball, the Stormcaller can create a storm cloud, and the Frostweaver has a conal frost attack. A class's passive abilities enhance their active ability or related damage type, like increased melee damage following a fireball for the Pyromancer, or generating a damage-absorbing frost shield when striking chilled enemies as a Frostweaver. There's also a Stormcaller passive that has a chance to hit an enemy with lightning every time you dodge, promoting a high-speed, mobile playstyle. Honestly, I initially thought only having one active ability would make classes feel shallow and samey, but the passive abilities are really where variations in gameplay and character build can shine. You can further invest into a specific passive ability when completing a zone where you're given a random selection of 3 passives for your class to rank up. Yes, this is a roguelike after all, and what would a roguelike be without a splash of RNG character building? Within each zone, you'll also get to choose from 3 random stat-based power-ups when clearing a room. This can include things like increased damage for each element, faster run speed, increased health, or higher pushback damage. They also come in different rarity levels, starting at green, then blue, then purple, with the bonus you receive from a power-up increasing with rarity. RNG willing, this is where you'll really be investing into the numerical power of your build, and many of these same stats can be found on the weapons you pick up. It was nice to see options for offense, defense, and movement, making choosing a power-up an actual thoughtful decision instead of automatically picking whichever one gave the most appropriate damage increase. One that I found incredibly useful was decreased stamina cost on dash, which made stamina management immensely easier and, more importantly, kept the Darkblade quiet. Another means of progressing your character during a run is through boons. Boons are obtained by defeating a powered-up, abyssally infused enemy and interacting with the purple crystal that appears after he dies. You'll then be presented with 4 randomly selected boons among a full list of boons that's actually fairly impressive for such an early access title. Boons offer much more unique enhancements to your character. There's safer options that add different effects for each elemental damage type, or ones that enhance your parry and pushback. However, if you're not a coward, many of the boons come with a level of risk, like Bloodbound Fury, which limits your health to 20% of your max health, but grants double damage. Or Energized March, which increases your stamina regeneration, but forces you to take damage if you drop below 20% stamina. These boons are just another aspect of the game that adds a layer of risk versus reward and an added challenge that significantly changes how you approach a run. And I love this as gameplay variation is incredibly important when you're looping through the game over and over again. One last aspect of progression I wanted to call out, and something that was actually added just a day or two before I started recording footage for this video, is inscriptions. Inscriptions are added effects that can appear on weapons that add a little bit of extra flavor to combat. For example, there's an inscription that gives your attacks a chance to shoot out metal spikes to give you some range, or one that creates a black hole on kill for a bit of crowd control. However, each inscription first needs to be unlocked by collecting scrap. You can scrap any weapon you come across, and once you reach 1000 scrap, you'll earn a new inscription, which will then be added to the pool of inscriptions that can appear on future weapon drops. Not only does this give you something else to progress toward, but it also makes it so you can actually do something with all of those unneeded weapons instead of leaving them behind. I noticed that this was actually something that the devs implemented in direct response to player feedback, so it's great to see them actively listening and engaging with their community. With a solid foundation for an addicting gameplay loop and dynamic in-game character progression that makes each run feel like a mostly fresh experience, I found Darkblade Ascent to be a promising melee roguelike RPG. While it may lack variety in some areas like weapon and talent choices, these are things that can easily be expanded on over time as the game progresses through early access. And knowing the devs are actively listening to and implementing feedback, I have no doubt the game will continue to ascend and find its place in the roguelike genre. That's all for now though, so if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or sharing your thoughts on Darkblade Ascent in the comments below. I appreciate every bit of interaction and support as I love making videos just like this one. So please consider subscribing to support the channel, and as always, thank you for watching.